Our reality is just the final draft. The earlier versions were absolute chaos. Today, we're showing you the crossed-out paragraphs of history, the moments where a single yes instead of a no would have given us a world with a nuked moon, a Spanish China, and a giant pyramid of the dead in London. This isn't the history you learned, it's the history you almost lived. 1. You know the Statue of Liberty, the ultimate symbol of America? Well, she was very nearly an Egyptian woman guarding the Suez Canal. I'm not kidding. Before she was welcoming immigrants to New York, her sculptor, Frédéric Bartholdi, pitched a nearly identical design to Egypt. His vision was a colossal peasant woman in robes holding a torch, with the catchy name Egypt carrying the light to Asia. She would have served as a lighthouse and a monument. But the Egyptian government took one look at their bank account, saw nothing but dust and cobwebs, and politely declined the giant, extremely expensive statue. So Bartholdi, being a resourceful guy, simply gave her a new crown, changed her backstory, and sold his brilliant pre-packaged idea to the Americans. One country's financial crisis is another's most iconic landmark. 2. In the late 1950s, the world was obsessed with atomic energy, and the US government thought it could solve any problem with a simple solution: nuke it. This led to Project Chariot, a plan so bonkers it sounds like it was written by a cartoon villain. The goal was to create a brand new harbor in Alaska by detonating 5 thermonuclear bombs right on the coastline. They called this peaceful geographical engineering, which is a terrifyingly calm way of saying, let's blow up our own state with H-bombs for convenience. Thankfully, a small group of scientists and local inhabitants raised their hands and pointed out that a harbor glowing with deadly radiation might not be great for, trade, fishing, or general living. The project was eventually shelved, proving that sometimes the best plan is to not use nuclear weapons for landscaping. 3. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a declassified document that will make your skin crawl. In 1962, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously approved a plan called Operation Northwoods, a proposal to justify war with Cuba by having the CIA commit acts of terrorism on American soil and blame them on Castro. The list of ideas was pure evil genius. They considered hijacking passenger planes, sinking U.S. ships, planting bombs in major cities, and even orchestrating a violent terror campaign in Washington, D.C. This wasn't some low-level memo. It was a formal proposal handed directly to President John F. Kennedy's administration. Thankfully, Kennedy acted as the sole adult in the room, took one look at this insane plan to murder his own citizens, and shut it down immediately, saving America from itself. 4. If you thought nuking Alaska was bad, just wait. The U.S. Air Force, deep in the throes of Cold War paranoia, came up with Project A119. The plan? To detonate a nuclear bomb on the freaking moon. And not for science. This was purely for showing off. The goal was to create a mushroom cloud so massive and bright that it would be visible from Moscow with the naked eye. It was the ultimate "my dad can beat up your dad" move on a cosmic scale. A young, pre-cosmos Carl Sagan was even on the team calculating the fallout. The project was only canceled because they were afraid the rocket might fail and detonate over American soil, or that the public wouldn't be too thrilled about them nuking the moon. It's a fine line between superpower and supervillain. 5. In the 1820s, London was facing a serious problem. Its cemeteries were overflowing. So, architect Thomas Wilson proposed a very normal and not at all creepy solution: the pyramidrome. This was a plan to build a gigantic 94-story pyramid on Primrose Hill in the middle of the city, designed to house 5 million dead bodies. It would have been taller than St. Paul's Cathedral and served as a permanent granite-clad mountain of the dead looming over London. Each corpse would get its own catacomb in this absolutely bonkers necropolis. The project was pitched as a visionary solution, but the public and potential investors found the idea of a giant, commercialized tomb in their backyard to be surprisingly a little bit grim. The Pyramid of the Dead thankfully never got built. 6. Does the current calendar with its random number of days per month drive you insane? Well, in the 1920s, the United States seriously considered fixing it with the International Fixed Calendar. The system was beautifully simple: 13 months, each with exactly 28 days. Every month started on a Sunday and ended on a Saturday. Your birthday would be on the same day of the week forever. They even named the new month Sol, placing it neatly between June and July. There was one leftover day each year called Year Day, a worldwide holiday. It was logical, efficient, and almost happened. But religious groups who were upset about a fixed Sabbath, combined with general human resistance to change, killed the idea. So now we're stuck with this chaotic mess forever. 7. German architect Herman Sörgel looked at the Mediterranean Sea in the 1920s and had a thought only a true mad genius could have. What if we just got rid of most of it? His project, called Atlantropa, was a plan to build a gigantic dam across the Strait of Gibraltar. This would cut off the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, causing the sea level to drop by hundreds of meters. This would create millions of square miles of new land, uniting Europe and Africa into a new supercontinent and providing supposedly limitless energy. The minor side effects would include turning coastal cities like Venice into landlocked dust bowls, causing an irreversible ecological apocalypse, and almost certainly starting dozens of wars over the new real estate. Sörgel spent his life promoting this terrifyingly ambitious and stupid idea, but thankfully nobody ever gave him the money. 8. Before he was a revolutionary leader and the bearded face of anti-Americanism, Fidel Castro was a seriously talented baseball pitcher. In the 1940s, his powerful arm and wicked curveball at the University of Havana attracted the attention of scouts from Major League Baseball. The New York Giants and the Washington Senators were both reportedly interested in signing him to a professional contract. Just take a moment to imagine that alternate timeline. Instead of leading a communist revolution, Castro could have been on the pitcher's mound at Yankee Stadium. The entire Cold War might have been different. Instead of the Bay of Pigs invasion, there might have been intense baseball rivalries. It's a bizarre thought that a career choice between sports and politics completely reshaped modern history. 9. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, harbored a secret ambition that was wildly out of sync with his hip-shaking, leather-clad persona. He desperately wanted to be a federal agent for the FBI. In 1970, he famously wrote a letter to President Richard Nixon offering his services to help fight the drug culture and the hippie elements. He believed his celebrity status made him the perfect undercover agent, someone nobody would suspect. Nixon actually met with him and gave him an honorary Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge, which Elvis apparently carried with him for the rest of his life. Just imagine Agent Presley, in a sequined jumpsuit and sunglasses trying to infiltrate a rock festival. The sheer absurdity is staggering, and it's a bizarre footnote showing that even the biggest star in the world sometimes just wants to be a government employee. 10. Washington, D.C., with its swamps and political gridlock, is the undisputed heart of American power, but it was almost abandoned for a new home in the heartland. After the Civil War, there was a serious movement to relocate the nation's capital to a more central, less vulnerable location. The leading contender was St. Louis, Missouri, but cities in Illinois and Ohio also threw their hats in the ring. Proponents argued that a capital in the Midwest would be better protected from foreign invasion and more connected to the country's westward expansion. For years, Congress debated bills to fund the massive move, and it was a surprisingly close call. Ultimately, tradition and the astronomical cost of rebuilding the entire federal government from scratch kept the capital in D.C., saving us from a reality where tourists flock to see the Lincoln Memorial somewhere in Illinois. 11. The state of Oklahoma is synonymous with cowboys, oil rigs, and the American West. But for a brief moment in history, it was almost a self-governing, predominantly French-speaking state. In the early 1900s, the 5 civilized tribes proposed creating their own state called Sequoia from what was then Indian Territory. To gain international recognition and allies, they developed surprisingly strong diplomatic ties with France. The proposed state constitution even considered making French a co-official language alongside English and the native tribal languages. Imagine an alternate Oklahoma, where you'd hear French spoken in the streets of Tulsa, and the state flag might have a fleur-de-lis on it. The U.S. Congress ultimately rejected the Sequoia proposal, merging the territory with Oklahoma Territory to create the state we know today. 12. The world thinks of Canada as the unshakably polite and stable neighbor to the north, but in 1995, the country came within a hair's breadth of completely disintegrating. The province of Quebec held a referendum on whether to separate from the rest of Canada and become its own sovereign nation. It was the culmination of decades of cultural and political tension, and the polls were terrifyingly close. When the votes were counted, the no side, which wanted to remain part of Canada, won by the slimmest of margins imaginable, 50.58% to 49.42%. A swing of just over 50,000 votes would have fractured the country in two. It was the world's most nail-biting, high-stakes divorce proceeding, and it almost ended with one of the biggest nations on Earth splitting apart in the most polite way possible. 13. The Eiffel Tower is so iconic that it's basically the global symbol for Paris, and for France itself. So it's almost impossible to believe that it was originally designed to be torn down after just 20 years. Built as the grand entrance for the 1889 World's Fair, it was intended to be a temporary structure. More shockingly, at the time, Parisian artists and intellectuals absolutely despised it. They signed petitions calling it a useless and monstrous factory smokestack that was a disgrace to the city's beauty. The plan was always to dismantle it in 1909, so what saved it from the scrapyard? Pure, boring practicality. The tower proved to be an incredibly valuable platform for a new technology, the radio telegraph antenna. Its usefulness as a communications tower was the only thing that saved the future icon from demolition. 14. Winston Churchill, the man who stared down the Nazi war machine, was almost taken out by a taxi in New York City. In 1931, while visiting the city for a lecture tour, he had a momentary lapse in judgment. Forgetting that Americans drive on the right side of the road, he looked left, saw nothing, and stepped off the curb directly into the path of an oncoming car. The impact was brutal, throwing him across the street and leaving him with a fractured skull and cracked ribs. He was critically injured and his recovery was slow. The entire course of World War II could have been radically different. The man who would later rally Britain during its darkest hour was nearly defeated not by an enemy army, but by a simple case of looking the wrong way while jaywalking. History can turn on the smallest of mistakes. 15. In the spring of 1945, as the ruins of the Third Reich smoldered, most of the world was desperate for peace. Not Winston Churchill. He was already planning World War III. He ordered his military planners to draw up a top-secret plan for a surprise attack on the Soviet Union, a country that was, at the time, still Britain's ally. Codenamed Operation Unthinkable, the goal was to launch a massive assault with British, American, and even rearmed German forces to push the Red Army out of Eastern Europe. The name itself tells you everything you need to know. His own generals reported back that the plan was militarily suicidal and would lead to total war. It was a terrifyingly audacious and reckless gamble that was ultimately shelved, but the fact that it was seriously considered is a chilling glimpse into Churchill's mindset. 16. The Chernobyl disaster was a world-altering catastrophe, but we now know it was horrifyingly close to being 10 times worse, an event that would have rendered half of Europe uninhabitable. After the initial explosion, the molten radioactive core of the reactor began melting through the concrete floor. Directly beneath it were massive pools of water, part of the plant's safety system. If the molten core reached that water, it would have triggered a second cataclysmic steam explosion. This blast would have vaporized the entire reactor and shot an apocalyptic amount of radioactive material into the upper atmosphere. The only thing that prevented this was the heroism of 3 engineers who volunteered for a suicide mission, wading through radioactive water in near-total darkness to manually open the drain valves, saving millions of lives. 17. On September 26, 1983, the fate of human civilization rested on the shoulders of one man in a secret Soviet bunker, Stanislav Petrov. Suddenly, alarms blared. Computers, with all the certainty of modern technology, reported that the United States had launched 5 nuclear missiles directly at his country. His job was simple: confirm the attack and give the order for a full-scale retaliatory strike that would end the world. But Petrov had a gut feeling. It just seemed wrong. Why only 5 missiles? Defying every protocol and the screaming red lights, he reported it as a system malfunction. He was right. It was a computer glitch caused by a rare alignment of sunlight on high-altitude clouds. One man's intuition was the only thing standing between humanity and total thermonuclear annihilation. 18. While everyone was busy making jokes about the Mayan calendar, a real, world-ending apocalypse almost hit us in 2012, and most people didn't even notice. In July of that year, the sun unleashed one of the most powerful solar flares ever recorded, a Carrington-level event. This colossal burst of electromagnetic energy shot out into space and ripped through Earth's orbit. We were just lucky. The planet had passed through that exact spot just 1 week earlier. Had the flare hit us directly, it would have fried power grids across the globe, destroying satellites, disabling the internet, and knocking out all electricity for months, possibly even years. It would have sent modern civilization back to the 1800s in an instant. We dodged a cosmic bullet of epic proportions, proving that the universe doesn't need our help to try and destroy us. 19. The name Charles Darwin is synonymous with evolution, the theory that reshaped biology and fundamentally challenged religious doctrine. Which is why it's so incredibly ironic that before he became a world-changing naturalist, his career path was pointing directly at the church. His father, despairing of his son's future, pushed him to study theology at Cambridge to become an Anglican parson. Darwin himself wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea, and his 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle was essentially the most elaborate gap year in history to put off the inevitable. Instead of a quiet life delivering sermons in the English countryside, he ended up writing the book that would cause more arguments at the dinner table than any other. The world's greatest scientific rebel was just one boring career choice away from being a village priest. 20. The iconic image of Che Guevara, the beret, the intense stare, the symbol of armed revolution, is burned into our collective consciousness. But before he was Comandante Che, he was Dr. Guevara. And he wasn't just any doctor. He was on a path to becoming a specialist in a field that's slightly less revolutionary: allergology. Plagued by severe asthma his entire life, Che was deeply interested in finding a cure for allergies. He conducted research, published papers, and could have easily spent his life in a quiet clinic telling patients to avoid cats and pollen. It was a single motorcycle trip across South America where he witnessed extreme poverty and injustice that turned him from a man who wanted to cure individual ailments into a man who wanted to overthrow entire political systems with a rifle. 21. After his final crushing defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had conquered most of Europe and crowned himself emperor, had one last desperate escape plan: to flee to America and start a new life as a common citizen. I am not making this up. He had his bags packed, passports arranged under a fake name, and a ship waiting to take him across the Atlantic. He dreamed of buying some land and living out his days as a gentleman scientist, far from the chaos of European politics. Just imagine Napoleon, the military genius, trying to settle down in Louisiana or Texas, maybe getting into arguments with his neighbors over a fence. But the British blockades were too tight. He was captured and sent to the desolate island of St. Helena, trading his American dream for a miserable exile. 22. On March 30th, 1981, John Hinckley Jr. tried to assassinate President Ronald Reagan. In the chaos, Reagan was bundled into a car, and everyone thought he was unharmed. They were wrong. A ricocheting bullet had actually hit him, piercing his lung and lodging itself less than an inch from his heart. If that bullet's path had been microscopically different, Reagan would have died, and the entire history of the 1980s would have been rewritten. George H.W. Bush would have become president, the hardline anti-Soviet rhetoric might have softened, and the final decade of the Cold War could have played out in a completely different way. The course of modern history, from economic policy to the fall of the Berlin Wall, was literally hanging by a thread, decided by a single inch of flesh and bone. 23. The tropical paradise of Hawaii, with its iconic beaches and aloha spirit, was almost a chilly outpost of the Russian Empire. In the early 19th century, the Russian-American company, which mostly dealt in fur trading in Alaska, sent a German doctor named Georg Schäfer to the islands to establish a trading post. But Schäfer was a little overambitious. He went completely rogue, started building Russian forts, raised the Russian flag, and tried to convince a local king to pledge allegiance to the Tsar of Russia. For a brief, bizarre period, it looked like the Hawaiian Islands might become a strategic Russian territory in the middle of the Pacific. But when news got back to Tsar Alexander III, he was horrified by his agent's aggressive freelance colonialism and immediately disavowed the whole operation, narrowly preventing a future where Hawaiian shirts might have been replaced with fur hats. 24. Everyone knows Columbus discovered America in 1492, except for the Vikings who actually got there 500 years earlier. They established a settlement called Vinland in modern-day Newfoundland around the year 1000. But the real what if isn't that they arrived. It's that they didn't stay. Their small settlement was eventually abandoned due to hostile conflicts with the native population and a ridiculously long supply line back to Greenland. But imagine if they had succeeded. What if thousands of Norse settlers had followed, creating a permanent Viking presence in North America? Columbus would have arrived not in a new world, but in a land already populated by a hybrid culture of Norse pagans and Native Americans. The entire history of the continent, from language to religion to war, would be an unrecognizable, axe-wielding alternate reality. 25. In the 16th century, the Spanish Empire was the undisputed global superpower, a colonial machine that had already devoured most of the Americas. But for the Spanish, that wasn't enough. They looked east and saw the ultimate prize: Ming Dynasty China. Senior Spanish officials in the Philippines, led by Governor Francisco de Sand, drew up a detailed and incredibly audacious plan for a full-scale invasion. They requested a modest force of just 10,000 to 12,000 Spanish soldiers, convinced they could topple an empire of 60 million people with sheer military superiority and religious fervor. King Philip II of Spain seriously considered the proposal, but his attention was ultimately drawn away by more pressing matters, like constant wars in Europe. The plan was shelved, saving China from becoming a Spanish colony and the world from a truly bizarre clash of civilizations. 26. The Second Punic War was the ancient world's equivalent of a heavyweight title fight, a brutal, 17-year struggle between Rome and Carthage was dangerously close to winning. Their brilliant general, Hannibal Barca, had crossed the Alps with elephants, inflicted a series of devastating defeats on the Romans, and at the Battle of Cannae, he completely annihilated the largest army Rome had ever assembled. For a moment, the city of Rome itself was defenseless, its gates wide open. Hannibal's generals begged him to march on the capital and burn it to the ground. But, in one of history's most debated decisions, he hesitated. That hesitation gave Rome the breathing room it needed to rebuild and eventually win the war. Had Hannibal sacked Rome, there would be no Roman Empire, no Latin language dominating Europe, and the entire foundation of Western civilization would be Carthaginian. 27. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world before his 33rd birthday. Then, at the absolute peak of his power, he died suddenly from a fever in Babylon. But what if he hadn't? What if he had lived another 30 or 40 years? His plans were far from complete. He was on the verge of launching an invasion of the Arabian Peninsula, and his gaze was already turning west towards Carthage, Sicily, and the rising power of Rome. A living Alexander, with his unstoppable army and visionary ambition, would have undoubtedly continued his conquests. The Hellenistic Empire would have been consolidated, not fractured, and the young Roman Republic would have been crushed before it even had a chance to become an empire. The world would have been shaped not by Roman law and legions, but by Greek philosophy and phalanxes. 28. In the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, decided it wanted to add Japan to its collection. Kublai Khan sent two massive invasion fleets, some of the largest naval forces the world had ever seen. And both times, they were on the brink of success. They landed, fought bloody battles, and pushed the samurai defenders to their limits. But both times, just as the Mongols were poised for a major breakthrough, a massive typhoon appeared out of nowhere and completely annihilated their fleet. The Japanese called these storms the kamikaze, or divine wind, believing them to be a sign of heavenly protection. Without those two perfectly timed and ridiculously convenient storms, Japan would have almost certainly fallen, becoming another province in a globe-spanning Mongol empire. 29. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain sent the Invincible Armada, a colossal fleet of 130 ships, to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I and crush the English Reformation once and for all. On paper, it was a sure thing. The Spanish were the dominant naval power, and England was a scrappy underdog. The plan was to sail to the Netherlands, pick up a massive Spanish army, and invade England. But a combination of brilliant English naval tactics, including the use of fire ships and some absolutely terrible weather, completely shattered the Spanish invasion. A powerful storm, which the English called the Protestant wind, scattered the retreating armada, wrecking dozens of ships on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Had the armada succeeded, England would have become a Catholic vassal state. There would be no British Empire, and we might all be speaking Spanish right now. 30. In 1917, World War I was a bloody stalemate, and the United States was still stubbornly neutral. Germany, desperate to break the deadlock, made a secret proposal to Mexico in a coded message known as the Zimmermann Telegram. The deal was simple. If Mexico declared war on the United States, Germany would help them reconquer the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona after the war was over. It was a wildly provocative and frankly stupid plan. But the real blunder was that British intelligence intercepted and decoded the message. They promptly handed it over to the Americans. The publication of the telegram caused an absolute firestorm of outrage across the US, becoming the final nail in the coffin of American neutrality. Without this diplomatic own goal of epic proportions, the US might have stayed out of the war, potentially changing its entire outcome. 31. The Battle of Tours in 732 is one of those pivotal moments you probably skimmed over in history class, but it fundamentally shaped the future of Europe. The massive, seemingly unstoppable army of the Umayyad Caliphate had swept across North Africa, conquered Spain, and was now pushing deep into the heart of France. It looked like nothing could stop the Islamic conquest of the entire continent. The last line of defense was a Frankish army led by Charles Martel. Against all odds, in a brutal day-long battle, the Franks not only held their ground but completely routed the invading army, killing its commander. This single victory halted the Muslim advance into Western Europe, preserving Christianity as the dominant religion of the continent. Had Charles Martel lost, the cultural, religious, and linguistic map of Europe would be completely unrecognizable today. 32. The discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928 was a complete and utter accident. He was a notoriously messy scientist who went on vacation, leaving a stack of petri dishes contaminated with bacteria on his lab bench. When he returned, he noticed that mold had grown on one of the dishes, and around that mold, the bacteria were completely dead. Most people would have just thrown the contaminated dish away. But Fleming's curiosity led him to investigate, and in doing so, he stumbled upon the world's first antibiotic. Without that one lucky, contaminated petri dish, the age of antibiotics might have been delayed by decades. Millions of people who survived bacterial infections, from simple cuts to major surgery, would have died. It's a terrifying reminder that one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in history was basically a happy little lab accident. 33. The sale of Alaska from Russia to the United States in 1867 is often mocked as one of the dumbest deals in history, at least from Russia's perspective. They sold a territory twice the size of Texas, rich with gold, oil, and other resources, for a measly $7.2 million. But here's the twist. The Americans weren't the first, or even the preferred, buyers. Tsar Alexander II initially offered Alaska to Great Britain. The British, who already controlled neighboring Canada, seemed like the logical choice. But after some consideration, they turned him down, viewing the vast, frozen territory as worthless and too difficult to govern. Only then did the Russians, desperate for cash after the Crimean War, and fearing they couldn't defend the territory from the British anyway, turn to the United States. A simple no from London led to the US becoming an Arctic nation and fundamentally redrew the map of North America. These 33 events are just the documented insanity. History's graveyard is filled with thousands of other bullets we dodged, and we know for a fact we've missed some terrifying ones. So, what's the single most mind-blowing historical event that almost happened, which we were totally negligent to ignore? Expose our blind spots in the comments. If you enjoyed digging through the trash can of rejected realities, show some support and subscribe.